I need you to picture this before we begin. Not history, not a documentary, not a black and white photo in a textbook. A morning. A normal, stubbornly ordinary summer morning. Because that's the trap, if you can call it a trap. You think catastrophe arrives with a warning label, a dramatic soundtrack, a villain's speech. But the morning of August 6th, 1945 in Hiroshima sounded like cicadas and footsteps, and people complaining about food like they always did. And the sky looked like the sky always looked, bright. Almost too bright, like it was proud of itself. If you can stay with me until the end of this walk, you'll understand something that still twists inside my chest even decades later. The bomb didn't just destroy a city, it stole before. And once before is gone, you spend the rest of your life trying to remember what it felt like to be a person who thought tomorrow was guaranteed. Now, walk with me. I was young, teenage young, in Hiroshima in the summer of 1945. My name is not the important part. If you need a name, imagine I'm your sibling, your cousin, the version of you who still believes adults are in control. The war had already shrunken our lives. Not all at once, but like a belt pulled tighter every month. Rice was stretched thin. Clothes were patched so many times that even the patches had patches. We learned to laugh quietly because laughter felt like tempting fate. But we still had routines. And routines are what humans grab when everything else is falling apart. That morning, there were alarms earlier, air raid sirens that came and went like bad weather. We'd been trained to react, then trained to relax, then trained to react again. By 1945, you could feel your own fear getting tired. At some point, your body starts doing the math. If I run every time, I'll run forever. If I stay, maybe I get to live one normal day. So, when we got the all clear, we did what we always did. We went back outside. I remember petty details because petty details are what my mind clung to when the world split open. The warmth on the back of my neck. The smell of dust and summer sweat. A friend. Maybe it was a friend. Maybe it was a classmate. Complaining about her shoes like the war didn't exist. And my little brother. My little brother's voice in my ear before I left, asking me to bring something back, anything. A sweet, a pencil, a scrap of paper he could pretend was treasure. I told him I would. That promise is still lodged somewhere behind my ribs. And here's the thing about that morning. I didn't look up with dread. I didn't feel a dramatic chill. I didn't sense history. I was a teenager thinking about ordinary teenager things. Hunger, embarrassment, the way the day would drag, the way my mother's expression tightened when she thought we weren't watching. Then, somewhere far above us, an American B-29 bomber named Enola Gay released a uranium bomb nicknamed Little Boy over Hiroshima at about 8:15 a.m. local time. It fell for about 43 seconds, and it detonated in the air at around 1,968 feet, roughly 600 meters above the city. 43 seconds. Say 43 seconds out loud. That's shorter than a song chorus. Shorter than a decent joke. Shorter than the time it takes to find your keys when you're late. It was long enough, though, for a weapon to fall toward us while we continued being human. Walking, talking, planning lunch, thinking about home. And here's the first cliffhanger. one you already know the answer to. But your body will still tense as you hear it. We didn't hear it coming. Not like you hear thunder before rain. Not like you hear an engine close by. People ask, "Who did you know?" As if knowledge would soften what happened next. No, we did not know. Then the world became light. But light is too gentle a word. Light is what you use to read. Light is what helps flowers grow. Light is what your mother turns on when she checks on you at night. This was a white that didn't belong to Earth. A flash so absolute it felt like the sky had snapped a photograph of our souls. For the briefest instant, everything was frozen, like time itself blinked. And in that instant, my brain did something strange. It tried to label what I was seeing using the vocabulary it already had. Lightning, camera, sun, but none of those words fit. Because those things are part of nature, and this wasn't nature. This was an invention. Then came the silence, because your ears are always a fraction of a second behind reality. And then the air punched, not pushed, not nudged, punched. The shock wave hit like the world's largest fist. And it didn't feel like an explosion the way fireworks feel like explosions. It felt like the atmosphere itself had decided it hated us. Glass turned into invisible knives. Wood became shrapnel. Dust swallowed the day. I was thrown. Not in a graceful arc like a movie, but like a rag doll tossed by a bored child. I hit something hard. My mouth filled with grit. My skin stung with heat that didn't feel like summer heat. It felt like the air was boiling. And when I opened my eyes, I couldn't understand what I was looking at. Because Hiroshima, my Hiroshima, had been rearranged in a single breath. Buildings weren't damaged, they were missing. Streets weren't blocked, they were erased. Where a row of houses had been, there was open sky as if someone had scooped the city out with a giant spoon. And people were moving through it like sleepwalkers. Like they were trying to keep walking because stopping would mean admitting the universe had changed. Some were silent. Some were moaning. Some were calling names the way you call a pit that's run away. Softly at first, as if you don't want to scare it, and then louder, and then desperate. I called for my mother. Mother! My voice sounded wrong in my own ears, muffled by dust, strangled by fear. No answer, only the crackle of fire. Because yes, fire came fast. Heat rays ignited things. The blast turned homes into kindling. And the city, built with wood and paper and human hope, caught. If you've ever watched a small flame find the edge of a newspaper and then race across it, you know how hungry fire can be. Now imagine fire with an entire city as its meal. I stumbled through debris, calling again and again and again. And every time I took a breath, it tasted like burned metal and plaster. Then I saw them. The first person I saw clearly was a man walking without a direction, arms slightly raised, not because he was surrendering, but because his skin was wrong. I didn't know words like thermal burns then. I didn't know radiation dose. I didn't know blast injuries. I only knew that his skin looked like fabric that had been soaked and torn, hanging, peeling, moving when he moved, and he was still walking like a man who had errands. That image, people moving while already fatally injured, was one of the first lessons Hiroshima forced into us. A body can keep going even when life has already been stolen from it. We moved toward the river because someone said water. Someone always says water. In every disaster, water becomes the prayer everybody shares. And along the way, the city showed us a gallery of suffering I never asked to see. A mother holding a baby that didn't cry. A person whose face was swollen beyond recognition, like their identity had been erased. People with eyes wide and unfocused, not because they were staring, but because their minds had detached to protect them. A kind of shock that makes humans look like dolls. Later, when I finally encountered survivor testimony that matched what I'd seen, I realized my memory wasn't exaggerating. Survivors described walking toward the river and seeing victims with severe burns. Skin peeled, bodies bleeding, people crawling. That day, the river became crowded with the living and the dying, and it didn't have enough mercy for everyone. The strangest thing that day wasn't the fire. It wasn't the ruined city. It wasn't even the bodies. It was the way the sky looked afterwards. Because after the blast, there were moments when the dust shifted and the light came back in patches, and your brain wanted to believe the world was simply dusty, like after a storm, like after an earthquake, like something you could clean. But Hiroshima was not dirty. Hiroshima was changed at the level of the air, and we didn't know it yet. In the hours after the detonation, people tried to do what humans always do. They tried to help. But the places built for help were shattered. Hospitals destroyed, clinics overwhelmed, doctors and nurses injured or dead, supplies burned. So help became improvised. Help was a stranger tearing their own sleeve to wrap someone's wound. Help was sharing a sip of water you knew you needed for yourself. Help was picking up a piece of roofing and using it like a stretcher. Help was lying. Yes, lying. Telling someone, "You'll be okay," when you could see their skin was coming off. Telling someone, "We'll find your family," when you could smell death on the wind like a second kind of smoke. Because the truth was too heavy to hand someone while they were still trying to stand. I searched for my mother until my throat went raw. I don't remember when I stopped searching and started surviving. It's not a clean line. Survival creeps in like dusk. At some point, you stop asking, "Where is she?" and start asking, "Where can I breathe?" At some point, you stop being a child and become a creature. Then, later that day, rain came. Not everywhere, not gentle. But where it fell, it was dark, thick with soot and ash. It stained skin. It tasted wrong. People later called it black rain. It fell about 1 to 2 hours after the explosion, formed when intense fires lofted ash into the atmosphere and seeded the clouds. We did not know what we were swallowing. We were just thirsty. That's another theft no one talks about enough. Disaster steals your ability to be picky. It takes choices away until all that's left is instinct. We drank. We licked rain off our hands, and we let it run into our mouths because our tongues felt like dried cloth. And the next day, then the next, people began to get sick in ways that didn't match the injuries we could see. Some people who looked fine on the first day collapsed later. Some developed fevers. Some bled. Some had diarrhea. Some had hair come out in clumps when they touched their heads. We didn't have a neat label for it in those first chaotic months, but we now know survivors experienced acute radiation symptoms, and one of the most reliably reported early symptoms was epilation, hair loss, documented through large survivor interviews conducted later. Imagine the cruelty of that. You survived the flash, survived the falling buildings, survived the fire, and then your own body begins betraying you quietly, and you don't even know why. That uncertainty becomes its own wound, because if you don't know what's killing people, then you also don't know how to protect the ones you love. And that brings me back to my mother. In my memory, I find her in fragments, her hands sorting rice, her voice calling me for dinner, her expression when she was trying not to show fear. In the aftermath, I found many people, but not her. I found a sandal I thought might be hers and held it like it could speak. I found a scrap of cloth and pressed it to my face, inhaling smoke and dust like it was perfume. I found nothing that gave me certainty, and grief without certainty is a special kind of torture. It leaves you pacing in your mind forever, searching corners that no longer exist. Now, I'm signed to give you a number, and I'm going to beg you not to let it become cold. The city of Hiroshima estimates that approximately 140,000 people had died by the end of December 1945, when the acute effects of radiation had subsided. That number includes people killed instantly and people who died later from burns, injuries, and radiation sickness. But 140,000 is not a number. It's the sound of thousands of homes going quiet. It's meals left on tables. It's a child's hand reaching for a mother who never reaches back. It's promises like mine to my brother, turning into stones you carry forever. And still, Hiroshima was not the end. Here's the part that shakes me even now, because it reveals something about the world that's hard to accept. 3 days after Hiroshima, while we were still wandering through ash, or while we were still trying to find bodies that had become unrecognizable, while we were still whispering prayers to any god who might be listening, the world dropped another atomic bomb. August 9th, 1945. And this time, the tragedy has an added twist, one that proves how quickly a city can become a secondary option. The mission's primary target was Kokura. Nagasaki was the secondary target. Think about that. Think about living your life in a city, arguing about food, falling in love, worrying about school, and realizing later that you were someone's backup plan. That's what war does. It turns human beings into checklists. On August 9th, the B-29 boxcar carried the plutonium bomb nicknamed Fat Man. Nagasaki was overcast, like Kokura was. The aircraft reached Nagasaki with fuel becoming critically limited, and a gap in the clouds allowed the bombardier to identify target features. The bomb detonated at 11:02 a.m. over Nagasaki. If Hiroshima was a flash that stole my childhood, Nagasaki was a second flash that stole my remaining illusions. Because after Hiroshima, part of me, part of many people, wanted to believe it was a one-time nightmare. A horrible exception. A singular horror. But Nagasaki proved it could happen again. Not in a century, not in a generation, in 3 days. My cousin's earlier message had joked about the hills of Nagasaki, like they offered protection. And it's true that Nagasaki's geography, The valley and surrounding hills shaped the pattern of destruction compared to Hiroshima's flatter center. But shaped is not the same as prevented. Nagasaki still became fire and ruin, and bodies asking for water. And the official record from Nagasaki's peace materials is blunt in the way only official grief can be blunt. An estimate up to the end of December 1945 lists 73,884 deaths and 74,909 injuries. 73,884. I want you to imagine saying that number as names, because that's what it was. My cousin survived the initial moment. Many did. Some were protected by distance, by walls, by luck, by the angle of a hill. But survival didn't mean done. It meant entered the long hallway. And that hallway had doors labeled things like sickness, grief, stigma, nightmares, chronic pain, and questions that never get satisfying answers. When the news finally reached us properly, because communication in the aftermath was shattered, people reacted in ways you might recognize. Some refused to believe it. Some went numb, some screamed, some prayed, some became very quiet. Because quiet was the only place left to put that much horror. And then, only days later, another sound arrived. Not an explosion, a voice on the radio. On August 15, 1945, Japan's surrender was announced in the Emperor's broadcast. For some people, that moment was relief. For others, it was emptiness. For me, it felt like the world was announcing the end, while my personal world was still burning. Because the war ending did not resurrect my mother. It did not unburn the skin I had seen hanging from arms. It did not uncollapse the people who looked fine one day and were dead the next. It did not erase the taste of black rain. It did not give my brother the small gift I promised. It just stopped adding new bombs. And maybe that's why survivors can sound strange to outsiders. People expect a clean emotional arc. Tragedy, then closure. But Hiroshima and Nagasaki don't give closure the way stories do. They give aftermath. They give after forever. Years passed. The cities rebuilt because humans rebuild like they breathe. Grass grew in places people swore would never grow again. Trams ran again. Markets opened. Children were born who didn't remember the flash, and their laughter sounded like rebellion. And still, the victims carried the invisible part. The part inside the blood, the part inside the bone marrow, the part inside dreams. The long-term health effects of radiation were studied carefully for decades, and researchers have worked to separate myth from immeasurable reality. Because in the shadow of nuclear weapons, facts matter, and fear spreads fast. But you asked me not to give boring details. So let me tell you the emotional truth those studies can't fully hold. Even when you survive, you don't get to go back to who you were. You become someone else. You become the person who knows what a city sounds like when it's dying. You become the person who flinches at bright light. You become the person who hears the word August and tastes ash. And you become the person who realizes the cruelest weapon isn't only heat and blast. It's uncertainty. Because uncertainty is what keeps you replaying everything. If I had taken a different street, would I have found my mother? If I had stayed home, would my brother have died instead? If the siren hadn't cleared, if the sky had been cloudy, if the bomb had malfunctioned? That kind of thinking can eat a life. So survivors learn to do something brave and strange. They learn to live anyway, to laugh anyway, to fall in love anyway, to cook anyway, to tell stories anyway. And that brings me to the walk I want you to take with me now, not through rubble, but through memory. In Hiroshima, there is a place that stands like a rib cage against the sky, the remains of a building now known as the Ginbaku Dome, preserved as a reminder. In Nagasaki, the peace records and memorial spaces mark the time, 11:02, as if time itself deserves a monument. These places don't shout. They don't need to. They do something harder. They ask you to look. Because looking is the beginning of responsibility, and responsibility is what survivors tried to hand to the future with trembling hands. If you've never listened to a survivor, I want you to understand that testimony is not just a story. It's a warning carved into breath. Nagasaki's peace institutions have worked to preserve survivor accounts on film, hundreds of recorded testimonies, because the human voice doesn't last forever. Hiroshima has also preserved accounts that describe scenes so unbearable many people could only speak of them years later. Photographer Yoshito Matsushige, for example, described being overwhelmed by what he saw and struggling even to take photographs because the scene felt like hell. That's a detail I want to pause on. A grown man, an adult with a camera, could barely bring himself to document what was in front of him. That's how intense it was. Now, another cliffhanger, because I want to keep you with me the way you asked. The most haunting part of this story isn't the bombs themselves. It's what came after the bombs became history. Because history has a dangerous habit. It turns screams into summaries. It turns bodies into numbers. It turns my mother into casualty estimate. And if that happens in your mind, you lose the point. So here's the point, spoken plainly. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were people living mornings. And those mornings were erased by weapons delivered with planning and precision. 8:15 and 11:02, 43 seconds of falling. Airbursts measured in feet and miters, while the people below were thinking about shoes and breakfast and family. That's the horror, not abstract destruction. The collision of the ordinary with the unimaginable. Now, let me bring it back to my brother, because stories need anchors, and my brother is mine. After the bombing, when the days blurred and hunger became my shadow, I finally found him. Alive. Not unhurt, not untouched, but alive. And the first thing he asked me, because children ask the simplest questions, was, "Did you bring it?" The thing I promised, the small treasure. I didn't have it. I didn't even have hands that looked like hands anymore. Scratched, swollen, dirty, with someone else's blood and the city's dust. I told him no, and his face twisted in disappointment the way a child's face does when they don't understand why adults fail. And for a second, I wanted to scream, not at him, at the universe. Because that's when I understood. The bomb didn't only kill people. It stole the tiny moments that make life feel safe. A treat, a joke, a complaint about shoes, a promise you can actually keep. So when I talk about Hiroshima, I'm not only talking about death. I'm talking about the theft of smallness. And when people ask, why should we still care? I want to answer like this. Because the future is built out of small moments, and nuclear weapons erase small moments in bulk. They erase them so fast you don't even get time to be afraid properly. And if you think, well, that was long ago, understand this. Survivors spent decades trying to keep the world from treating 1945 as just another chapter. Groups led by survivors, hibakusha organizations, have fought to keep nuclear weapons from becoming normalized, and their testimony has been recognized internationally, including through major peace awards in recent years. That recognition isn't about nostalgia. It's about urgency. Because as long as nuclear weapons exist, the possibility of another ordinary morning becoming a flash is not zero. And once you truly understand that, you can't unknow it. So, here's my final tension, my final question, my last hand reaching out to you through time. If you were walking to school, thinking about lunch, promising your brother a small gift, and in 43 seconds everything you love could be turned into ash, what would you want the future to remember about you? Not your politics, not your country, not the arguments adults have. Just you, the person inside the morning. That's why I told you this from the ground. That's why I didn't make it a debate. Because before Hiroshima was Hiroshima, it was home. Before Nagasaki was Nagasaki, it was home. And victims weren't symbols, they were people. Now, if you want to stay in the loop on this channel, don't let this be the last thing you watch, because this story connects to others that explain what happened next and why it matters. Watch my next video on how the world entered the nuclear age after 1945, how the fears spread, how the policies formed, and how survivors fought to make sure never again wasn't just a slogan. And watch the video after that about survivor testimony, how memory is preserved, why voices matter more than numbers, and what gets lost when the last witness is gone. Because this story doesn't end when this narration ends. It ends when we stop paying attention. And I don't want the world to forget our mourning.